Reading is from the book Habakkuk, chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 1. That's Habakkuk, chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 1. A prophecy that Habakkuk the prophet received. Habakkuk's complaint. How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Or cry out to you, violence, but you do not save? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore, the law is paralyzed, and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous, so that justice is perverted. The Lord's answer. Look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed, for I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told. I am raising up the Babylonians, that ruthless and impetuous people who sweep across the whole earth to seize dwellings not their own. They are feared and dreaded people. They are a law to themselves and promote their own honor. Their horses are swifter than leopards, fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their cavalry gallops headlong. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle swooping to devour. They all come intent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind and gather prisoners like sand. They mock kings and scoff at rulers. They laugh at all fortified cities. By building earthen ramps, they capture them. Then they sweep past like the wind and go on, guilty people whose own strength is their God. Habakkuk's second complaint. Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You have made people like the fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. The wicked foe pulls all of them up with hooks. He catches them in his net. He gathers them up in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. For by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me and what answer I am to give to this complaint.
All right, for those of you that are still flipping, trying to find Habakkuk, it's right after Nahum, so that ought to help. You're welcome. Years ago, I put together a formal debate over at Willamette, trying to answer the question, does the God of the Bible exist? The gentleman that I asked to take the pro position, yes, the God of the Bible exists, was raised as an atheist. And in college, he gave his life to Christ and became a Christian. The gentleman that I found to take the con position, that the God of the Bible does not exist, I found through the American Atheist Association website. His name is Tom. When I met him, I discovered that he was actually raised as a Christian And as a teenager, he renounced his faith and became an atheist. Promoting this debate was the easiest thing in the world. Atheist turns Christian, debates Christian turned atheist. Does the God of the Bible exist? Made for a movie, right? It was perfect. We held the debate. They answered questions. Tom's position was a fairly common one for an atheist to make. His position essentially boiled down to, because evil exists, God cannot. That was his argument. After the debate was over, a few students lingered to ask some questions, and it was just Tom and I in the auditorium. And I asked him, "What happened?" And he very candidly said, "My uncle happened." He began to tell me a little bit of his story. Tom was a pastor's kid. His uncle was on the worship team, was a prominent leader in his church. Week after week, Tom would watch his uncle up on the stage leading worship, and then later behind closed doors, he would watch his uncle get drunk and abuse his aunt and his cousins. He watched this happen day after day, week after week, month after month, and he knew he was a pastor's kid. He sat in church. He knew what he was supposed to do. He was supposed to pray. So he did, passionately, fervently, asked God to make it stop. And I'll never forget Tom's line. He said, "When my uncle didn't stop, I did. My uncle didn't stop, so I did. Tom just quit." Tom couldn't reconcile the tension between God's goodness and his uncle's badness, so he quit. He looked up every Sunday and saw his uncle behaving like an obedient, righteous Christian, and then later he looked up and saw him behaving like a wicked demon. How could God allow this to happen? Why didn't God answer Tom's pleas to make it stop? Tom wondered, if God is so good and if God is all-powerful, then why wouldn't his goodness and his power supersede the evil that I see in the world? Tom had good questions. These are fair questions. But when he didn't see any results, he quit. He doubted not only God's goodness, but his very existence. His uncle didn't stop, so he did. My friends, this is a cautionary tale, because if we're honest with ourselves, we're all vulnerable to heading down this same path. Why? Because we all have an uncle. And I'm not talking about a male relative. I'm talking about something that we look at and it just doesn't make sense. There's something in this world that vexes us. It confounds us. Something that creates tension in our soul that causes us to ask questions like, are you there, God? Are you listening to me? Do you even care about what I'm going through? How could you let this happen to me? Are you seeing this? We live in a broken, fallen world that causes us to see and experience injustice every day. And we know that things aren't supposed to be this way, and sometimes it makes us feel helpless. And as Christians, we know what we're supposed to do. We know what Philippians chapter 4 says. It tells us that we're supposed to be anxious for nothing, but by everything through prayer and supplication with thanksgiving. We're supposed to make our requests known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard our hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. We know that verse is there. We know what we're supposed to do. But what if we're met with silence? What if that peace never really gives us understanding that we so desperately desire? Worse, what if we're met with an answer that we just simply don't like? Habakkuk had some tough questions for God, and we're going to look at them over the next couple of weeks. It's a book filled with questions, and I've got a few questions for you to consider as we begin. Where do you go in your mind when you've got those tough questions that challenge your faith? What do you do in your times of silence? Do catastrophic thoughts drive you into despair? Do you have a tendency to travel down dark paths that depress you? Does the trouble that you see on the outside begin to create heartache on the inside? Does that deafening silence cause you to fill the void with unhealthy doubts about the goodness or even the very existence of God? What is your uncle? What is your ongoing struggle with God that pushes you to the edge of your faith? What is that thing that causes you to ask, God, why don't you do something? Habakkuk is going to show us the way that we ought to wrestle with the whys in our own life. Habakkuk is a unique book. We really don't know a lot about the author, but one thing that we do know for sure is the time period in which he wrote, as he references the Babylonian Empire. He writes his book in approximately 600 BC, 600 years before the time of Christ. If you rewind a bit, Israel used to be a united kingdom. Saul, David, Solomon, there was one kingdom. And then in about 1000 BC, that kingdom was divided into two. 10 tribes stayed in the north, they got to keep their name, Israel. 2 tribes in the south, they were now called Judah. Judah is where Habakkuk was. Once the kingdom was divided, as you might understand, Israel began to kind of fall into some moral decay. They slipped spiritually. They began to worship false gods. They fell into immoral practices and just general depravity. God in 720 sent the Assyrian Empire to punish the northern kingdom of Israel. They were taken into exile. God punished them and disciplined them for their wickedness, and Judah remained, but they continued to slip morally. Habakkuk saw the immorality and the depravity and the wickedness and the evil among his people, and that's the context in which Habakkuk writes this letter. It tells us in chapter 1 that he was a prophet. Verse 1 says, the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet received. Typically, prophets speak to the people about God. What makes Habakkuk unique is that he flips it, and he speaks to God about people. Typically, prophets give a declaration of what God has said, but we don't see a declaration. What we see in Habakkuk is a dialogue, a back and forth kind of question and answer. Habakkuk is a very unique look at the way this prophet of God engages God in dialogue on behalf of a people and the situation that he saw. Some translations will use the word oracle. That Habakkuk received an oracle or a prophecy. What was that? It was a heavy burden. It was a heavy message that the Spirit of God impressed upon Habakkuk. Habakkuk was a burdened man, not only because of this message that he had to deliver, but because of the times in which he lived. Habakkuk carried a heavy burden, and he's processing that burden in real time. And we get to kind of peek behind the curtain and watch this whole dialogue, this drama unfold. You can feel the pain. You can feel the agony and the anguish in verse 2. The burden on his heart was so heavy. Listen to what he says. How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen? Or cry out to you violence, but you do not save. You can feel the heaviness. He's in agony, he's in turmoil, and he's crying out to God, but God seems to be either distracted or uncaring. He's not responding to Habakkuk. This leads us to the first principle that I want us to catch this morning. Wrestling with the why can lead us to deeper trust in the who. Habakkuk felt conflicted by what he saw, but he didn't stuff his feelings. He didn't shy away from asking the tough questions. He didn't get disillusioned or jaded. He went straight to God and began to work things out with him. The name Habakkuk means to embrace or to wrestle. How many huggers do we have in the room? How many huggers do we have in the room? You haven't seen someone for 5 minutes and you're like, get in here, we got a hug. I mean, not that many huggers, really? Well, when you hug somebody, what do? You get in close and you hold on. Some of you hold on a little longer than you ought, but you get in close and you hold on. Well, that's what it means to embrace. When you wrestle with someone, you take that to a completely different level. You get really close and you hold on really tight. Wrestling's hard work. I have a few wrestlers in my world. Wrestlers are typically pretty tough. They're pretty strong. They're in good shape because it's exhausting to wrestle. It's hard work. Typically it's hard because half the time you're trying to pull somebody's forearm off your trachea. Wrestling's hard. Wrestlers are typically in pretty good shape. They're strong. And here's the spiritual principle. Sometimes in spiritual terms, wrestling with God can strengthen your faith muscle. Look at what Habakkuk is wrestling with. Habakkuk is wrestling with some weighty issues. Tell me if you can relate. This is what Habakkuk is wrestling with God about. Verse 3. Why do you make me look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. There is strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted. Habakkuk is in agony. He's crying out to God. And when it says he's crying out, it doesn't mean he's calling out to God. To cry out is altogether different. It's sharing your agony and your inner turmoil. Habakkuk is burdened by what he sees around him. He feels helpless. He feels overwhelmed. He feels like justice is never going to prevail. When Habakkuk cries out violence, you know what the word in Hebrew for violence is? Hamas. And I'm not trying to make some political statement. I'm trying to make a relevance statement. 2,600 years ago, Habakkuk looks out his window, and every day what he sees is Hamas. He sees violence. He sees destruction. He sees calamity every single day. I don't know where you get your news from. I don't know if you still get the newspaper or if you still watch, TV for your news or if you get it on your news feed. But I bet you, if you're aware of what's going on in the world today, you look every single day and you see Hamas. Literally and figuratively. When you look around, even this very morning, more bombing in Israel. Everywhere we look, we are seeing the same things that Habakkuk saw all those years ago. If you're watching and if you're alert and if you're aware, you're very cognizant of the fact that we are right in the middle of a massively contentious political environment right now. We had a political candidate shot at and an innocent person was killed. Violence. Watching the RNC and the DNC, what did I see? Two parties that did nothing but villainize one another and sling insults designed to assassinate the character of the one they hate, all in the spirit of unifying our nation. Contention and strife. I find it interesting that we live in a time where there are folks that are suggesting that we modernize our interpretation of the scriptures. That we need to be more progressive in our thinking because the scripture is so antiquated and outdated and irrelevant. There are folks that are suggesting that we need to be more forward thinking in our perception of the truth because the Bible is so archaic and outdated and irrelevant. I'm sorry, but a man wrote something 2,600 years ago that sounds like it was written yesterday. I think the Bible's doing just fine in its relevance to contemporary issues. But we're still asking those questions, right? We're still asking those questions. Why so much violence? Why is there injustice? We're asking those big questions, but don't we ask a bunch more that are more personal? Aren't we asking questions like, how long, God, will my son be a prodigal? How long, God, until I gain victory over this addiction? Will I ever get married? Will we ever conceive? How much longer do I have to endure this physical pain? How long, God, will I have to wait until my suffering is over, until justice prevails, until my shattered life gets put back together? Habakkuk was in agony, and you might be today as well. My friend, if you're close to giving up, let me encourage you to keep wrestling with the why so that it might drive you closer to the who. Bring your pain, bring your suffering, bring your tough questions to the only one who can actually do anything about it, because God can handle your tough questions. Now, this point may seem obvious. I wrestled with whether or not to put this in my outline, because I knew I was dealing with such a scholarly and intelligent and erudite group. Why would I put something so sophomoric and obvious in my outline? Because it's so important. Were any of you raised in a family that had a don't question my authority mindset? Anybody ever have a coach that had a my way or the highway mentality? Anybody have a military background where you had it pounded into your head that I don't want you thinking for yourself. You just obey orders, soldier. Anybody ever raised in that kind of environment where you were taught, don't challenge authority, toe the line, be a good little Christian soldier, sir, yes, sir? Has that drifted over into the way you approach God? For a long time in my spiritual infancy, I really thought that questioning God or challenging him was akin to being faithless or maybe even being disobedient. I know the song that says, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. To challenge, to question felt to me like I'm not obeying, I'm not trusting. My friends, God can handle your questions. Habakkuk certainly wasn't the first person to ever question God. Some of the mightiest biblical prophets begged God for answers when life got difficult. Men like Isaiah, Job, Daniel, Hosea. Try to read 3 Psalms in a row. Try it. Try to read 3 Psalms in a row and not find David, a man after God's own heart, asking questions like, hey, God, where'd you go? Where are you? Why are my enemies triumphing over me? Why have you forsaken me? These biblical pillars of faith ask questions. How about Mary and Martha? Weren't super thrilled with Jesus. Hey, Jesus, why'd you wait so long? Wrote you a letter. Thanks for hanging out for 3 days. My brother died. You didn't do it right. You didn't show up in my timeline. Why? Why'd you do it that way? Habakkuk didn't ask a question that was out of the ordinary. The cry of Habakkuk's a common one. Many God-fearing men and women have come to a point in their lives where they feel like they just can't take it anymore. Like they're at the end of their emotional rope. But my friends, there's always one more thing you can do before you let go. Bring your question to God and let him respond. Why, God? Why do you make me look at injustice? Why so much violence? Habakkuk was in healthy dialogue. He wasn't being disrespectful. He wasn't being dishonoring to God or worse, disobedient. How do we know? Because God doesn't rebuke him. God isn't so insecure that he would take offense at one of his children simply acknowledging sin is prevailing and it ought not be this way. He welcomes the wrestling match. Remember the story of God wrestling with Jacob? Jacob was kind of a scoundrel. And Jacob was wrestling emotionally with kind of who he was and the issues that were facing him. And God appears in physical form and he gets real close to Jacob and he hangs on real tight. And he does business with Jacob. And when he's done, he knocked his hip out of socket so that for the rest of his life, he walked with a limp. Did God do that to be mean to him? No. He did it because He wants to change your perspective. He wants to get up real close to the who so that all the why questions can fade off into the distance. He did business with Jacob. God welcomes the wrestling match. So bring those questions. Please persist, labor, lean in. Don't give up. God can handle it, and you'll be better off because of it. After Habakkuk pours out his heart to God, he gets a response in verses 6 to 11. Habakkuk pours out his heart, and God, in a sense, responds and says, Habakkuk, I've got a plan. I'm up to something amazing. I mean, you're not going to believe it. I mean, that's what it says. You're not going to believe it. Look at the nations and watch. Be utterly amazed. This is going to amaze you. For I'm going to do something in your days. I'm going to respond to you, Habakkuk. Thanks for bringing that question to me. I'm going to do something that you will not believe, even if I told you. Here's the plan, Habakkuk. I'm going to send the Babylonians over to spank you real hard. And in the original Hebrew, Habakkuk's response was, wait, what? Pardon me? Did I hear that properly? I kind of was not expecting that. If you think Habakkuk was confused before, imagine what he's thinking now. Pardon me, God, did I hear you correctly? You're going to send that depraved, wicked, corrupt nation that's 10 times worse than we are to come invade us and discipline us? I thought you were a good God. I thought you promised to always protect us and to provide for us. I thought you gave us this land. Now you're going to send those perverse barbarians to take the land from us and send us into exile? That's your plan? God's response created a new problem for Habakkuk. The new problem was Habakkuk now had to decide, was he going to trust God's goodness even when he didn't like the answer? It is so easy to declare God is good when you pray about something and God says yes. It's easy to go to your prayer group and say, God answers prayers. He's so good. I'm going to hop on Facebook and tell everyone how great God is because I got a favorable response to my inquiry. You want to know what's hard, my friends? Is to continue believing that God is good even when you don't understand what he's up to. As I was reading this, I'm thinking about Habakkuk's face as he hears God's answer, and then he begins to respond with his second complaint. I see his face because I put Josiah's face on him. And I do that because of a conversation I had with him in the car when he was young, 8 years old. We're in the car, he's sitting behind me. He had done something naughty, and that's not important. I don't know what the infraction was, and I don't know what the discipline that I assigned him was. And that's not important. It's this conversation. We're driving along, and I hear from behind me, Dad, I'm sorry for what I did. And I could see him, and I could see that his face was despondent, and the apology seemed sincere. He looked downtrodden, and I said, Josiah, thank you so much for apologizing. That is so mature of you. I'm so proud of you. I forgive you. And I could see his countenance change. His eyebrows raised. He felt heartened and encouraged. And he said, Dad, do I still have the consequence? His face was about to change. I said, well, yes, Josiah, you still have the consequence. And I've taught all my kids to furrow their brow. They're awesome at it. And I just watched his face go. And he had his wait what moment. He said, but I apologized. I did what I'm supposed to do. I did the thing that you taught me. I admitted that I was wrong and I asked for forgiveness. And you're going to still discipline me? What kind of father are you? He said none of that. That was all in his face. I watched it. I could hear it. It was all over his face. He could not connect the dots. I thought you were good, and you're still going to discipline me? And I said, well, Josiah, yes, you still have the consequence. Your apology repaired our relationship, and that is so good. There was a barrier to our relationship, and you fixed it by saying you're sorry, but the discipline it's my job, it's my responsibility as your dad to train you and to teach you to not do that again. That is the exact same conversation that Habakkuk is having with God. Habakkuk's like, wait a second. I cannot believe that's your plan. Because listen to the way Habakkuk now responds. The tone and the tenor completely change. You hear agony and hardship and turmoil in the first complaint. Listen to the tenor, listen to the tone now when Habakkuk challenges God for that second time. Verse 12, O Lord, are you not from everlasting? Hey, God, are you not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Because I thought you were cool. Are we talking about the same God here? Because you don't sound right. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Then why do you tolerate the treacherous? Habakkuk is trying to connect dots that are just not congruent in his mind. You're supposed to be good, and you're supposed to be powerful, and you're doing bad things. You're doing it wrong, God. Habakkuk didn't like the answer, and he had a problem. He had this tension that he had to deal with. And the same tension kind of exists for all of us. That same tension exists when we bump into issues that don't seem congruent. And there's two paths we can take. We can either begin to believe that God isn't good because he doesn't seem to care, or we can believe that God simply isn't there. There must not be a good, all-powerful God, because if there was, he would deal with my problem, and he's not doing it right. It's so easy to trust God when things make sense. It is so easy to have faith when God responds positively to your prayers. But it's a test of our faith when God doesn't seem to make sense. And my friends, if God always responds to your prayers in the ways that you want him to, and according to your perfect timeline, you might want to consider if you're praying to the God of the Bible, or if you're praying to a God that you have fashioned after your own likeness. God created us in his image, and it's our job to align our fallen image with him and his will, not the other way around. When this tension exists, it forces us to say, will I be a person of faith and trust God even when I'm struggling with his goodness? Or will I cash in my chips and just quit? That's where my friend Tom was. He took his problem to God, and God did not respond the way he wanted to. He didn't remove the pain and suffering. He didn't remove the egregious hypocrisy of his uncle, who was doing unholy things, acting like a holy man. Tom did wrestle for a while, but ultimately he gave up. He stopped believing in the existence of a good, all-powerful God because the math didn't work out. Sometimes it may seem like God doesn't care. Sometimes it may seem like God is distant. Sometimes it may even seem like God is cruel. But God is always working. He is always working to purify and preserve his people, even if it seems mysterious or confusing to us. Notice the fact that God actually does respond to Habakkuk's initial question. Habakkuk says, hey, how long do I have to deal with this violence and evil? And God says, until I send the Babylonians. God responded to his question. God will respond to the sincere seeker. God will respond to the person who brings their request to him. Now, he may not always answer the why question. He may not respond according to the timeline you would prefer, but God responds to the faithful, sincere seeker. And God will deal with evil. And he will deal with it perfectly. God had to discipline Judah. I had to discipline my son, not because I'm cruel and mean, but because that is my role as a father. God needed to turn the people from their wickedness and their why to the who. God needed them to turn to him and to look at him, and rather than pursuing the evil that they were currently engaged in. God wanted them to wrestle with himself, and he needed to apply discipline to the situation in dramatic fashion. God is going to deal with evil. And as we close, I want you to notice where Habakkuk went when things got difficult. I want you to look at where Habakkuk went when things went from bad to worse, when God seemed most distant, most confusing, most unkind and uncaring. Look where Habakkuk went. Chapter 2, verse 1. I will stand at my watch and station myself on the rampart or on the watchtower. What's a rampart? What's a watchtower? It's a lookout. It's the highest place in the city. It's a lookout that was built for a century to stand watch and to look to see if there are invading armies that are on their way. Habakkuk went to the highest point in the city and he stood watch and he waited for the Lord to answer. Habakkuk was frustrated and he had just let God have his best shot. He was pretty brazen in his dialogue, in his complaint with God. But he had the guts to wait for God's response like a man. He didn't run to Twitter so he could complain. He didn't rant and rave in the streets. He didn't cash in his chips and quit. He waited. And he kept wrestling. He got really close and he hung on tight, exercising faith in the only one that could adequately answer his questions. He went to the watchtower and he waited for the sovereign God to reveal his goodness. He went to the lookout so that he could look up. And that's such an important thing to do, because when you look up, it's so much more difficult to see all those problems that are weighing you down. Just this last week, I got a phone call from a friend. He was in trouble. He had been seeing a counselor and that just wasn't working. He had gotten to the end of his emotional rope. His anger was out of control. His relationships were on the rocks, and he was a mess. He asked me a question that I frankly can't remember ever being asked in 30 years of ministry. It's a good question. He said, "Hey, Jeff, do you have a place that you go to kind of get away from all the noise and the chaos of life so that you can just kind of be alone and talk to God?" I said, "Yeah, I got a place." I sent him to Mount Angel. He spent the day at Mount Angel. He kind of went to his own little watchtower so that he could wrestle with God. He needed a lookout so that he could look up. And you know what happened? God met him there. And things began to change for him. He moved from frustration to faith, from desperation and despair to deepened faith in a God that he knew was good. When we bring our toughest questions to God, he builds in us our deepest faith. Habakkuk carried a heavy burden, but he didn't carry it alone. Even when he sat in silence, he continued to ask God the tough questions. When he received a message that confused him, he didn't run for the hills. He courageously climbed the watchtower to wait for God to speak to him. When we take our questions to the Lord, he helps us turn our focus from our pain to his presence. And that's where he can do the work of building the kind of faith that endures, even when life doesn't make sense.